Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a time when staying alive didn't involve protein bars, bug-out bags, or Wi-Fi enabled security systems. You crouch low in a damp medieval village where the air smells faintly of wood smoke, wet hay, and a dozen types of sweat you don't want to name. You're parched, starving, and pretty sure that boil on your leg is starting to talk. Modern survivalists might have fancy gadgets, but tonight we're exploring 7 long-forgotten medieval survival techniques that somehow got lost in time. And frankly, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while we're getting cozy, drop your location and what time you're rewatching. I always love knowing where and when these little time machines are landing. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stumble across a small clearing at the edge of a village where a woman in a heavy wool dress is hunched over a bucket, stirring what looks like a mixture of mud, ash, and crushed-up charcoal. It smells faintly like a barbecue gone wrong. She's not making soup. She's making clean water. See, while modern preppers stockpile iodine tablets and pricey filter straws, medieval folks relied on a far humbler material: charcoal. Burned wood, cooled and crushed, then added to water. It doesn't look impressive, but it works. Charcoal's porous texture can absorb impurities, including some bacteria and toxins. This wasn't theoretical science, it was desperate necessity. That water drawn from the well might contain things even the town pig wouldn't drink, but charcoal helped make it drinkable. The technique was intuitive, passed down like a grandmother's stew recipe with just a touch more risk of dysentery. You swirl a rough wooden spoon through the bucket and watch the dark specks settle, slowly filtering the cloudy liquid into something that, well, wouldn't kill you immediately. Charcoal was even used in cloth form. Linen bags filled with crushed charcoal were dropped into barrels of water to keep it fresh during the warmer months. Historians still argue whether this was widespread knowledge or something practiced only in more advanced regions of medieval Europe. But either way, the evidence suggests people caught on early that burnt wood meant better water. Let's be honest, this wasn't the medieval version of Brita. You didn't pour your goblet through a chic filter and call it wellness. This was gritty, murky, and slightly terrifying. Yet in a world without antibiotics, every drop mattered. One quirky tidbit? In some villages, charcoal wasn't just used for water. It was believed to absorb bad humors, the medieval version of vibes. So some folks slept with charcoal bags under their beds, believing it protected against nightmares and nosebleeds. You have to wonder if any of it actually worked, or if sleeping on lumpy sacks of soot was its own kind of deterrent to midnight distress. Picture yourself carrying a small pouch of charcoal tied to your belt, not as a style accessory, but a survival tool. Every sip of water might be a gamble, but with that tiny pouch your odds just improved. Slightly. Not enough to make you smug. Just enough to keep you from collapsing in the cabbage patch after your third sip. Imagine showing a modern survivalist your charcoal bag. They'd raise an eyebrow, then discreetly return to their tactical hydration bladder. But you're sipping soot water with medieval flair, and you're alive. And let's not ignore the irony. Centuries later, we'd rediscover this ancient wisdom and sell it back to each other in the form of 80 charcoal face masks and designer water bottles with built-in filters. Somewhere, a medieval peasant is chuckling from beyond the grave. The next time you take a long drink from a cold bottle, think of that village woman stirring her bucket. Her hands cracked, her sleeves damp, her eyes focused. Her family's health might literally hinge on whether that soot did its job. And no, she didn't have a TikTok explaining the benefits of activated carbon. She had trial, error, and the occasional funeral to remind her when she got it wrong. Still, there's something beautiful about it. This dark, primitive filtration process. It's quiet, it's grounded, and it's unexpectedly elegant. In a time when death lurked in every corner, a pinch of black dust in a wooden bucket offered just a sliver of safety. That, in its own gritty way, is medieval hope. You rise at dawn, wincing as your stiff limbs protest, and shuffle toward a cluster of frost-covered earthen mounds behind the village. From a distance, they resemble hobbit homes, or perhaps unusually lumpy graves. But get closer, and you realize they're root cellars, dug deep into the cool, dry earth to preserve food long after the harvest is gone. No refrigerator, no electricity, just dirt, stone, and a little architectural stubbornness. These underground food bunkers were the medieval equivalent of your modern prepper S walk-in freezer, minus the humming compressor and LED lighting. Inside, root vegetables like parsnips, turnips, onions, and carrots are layered in straw or sand to maintain temperature and moisture. The goal: keep things from freezing, but also stop them from rotting. Simple in theory, kind of terrifying in practice. You brush aside the moss-covered stone door, duck inside, and feel the air drop by several degrees. It smells of soil, old garlic, and the faint ghost of cabbage. There's no sound, just your breath and the rustle of straw as you fumble for a still firm potato. Spoiler, it's halfway sprouted, but it's edible. Congratulations, you've survived another day. Root cellars weren't just for veggies. Salted meats hung from hooks above, wrapped in cloth or dried animal stomachs. Barrels of pickled herring and brined eggs nestled in corners. Sometimes whole wheels of cheese were stored here, carefully waxed, aged, and protected from nosy rodents who were probably smarter than half the local population. One fringe technique? The cold trench bread box, a literal trench dug under the House S floorboards where loaves of bread were kept cool for weeks. And by cool, we mean moldy in a manageable way. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or a weird village one-off. But enough records mention floor bread to suggest it wasn't a fluke. You crouch in the dim cellar holding a rock-hard carrot like it's a jewel. There's something eerily satisfying about knowing that without even 1 degree of modern technology, medieval people could stretch their food into winter, and not just survive, but do so without screaming every time a cabbage started to go soft. Modern preppers could learn a thing or two here. Sure, they love their solar-powered chest freezers, but have they ever kept bacon edible with nothing but salt, a clay wall, and a prayer? You think not. And speaking of salt, this wasn't just a flavor booster. It was a currency, a treasure, and the duct tape of the medieval preservation world. The deeper root cellars often had small dugout compartments filled with salt where meat slabs were stored like sacred relics. Salt, cured, dried, and protected. You didn't just have salt, you managed it like an investment portfolio. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some cellars were built with fake walls. Why? To hide food from raiders or from local lords who like to inspect supplies for tax purposes. You think hoarding is a modern phenomenon? Please. Margaret the Miller, S. wife, had a whole fake turnip wall back in 1242. She was that serious about soup security. You might wonder, how did they keep track of what was stored where, especially without post-it notes or barcodes? Simple. Knots in hanging strings, symbols carved into beams, or, more often, just old-fashioned memory. If you forgot where you stored the apples, too bad. They'd tell you when the cellar started smelling like vinegar and disappointment. There's a reason root cellars still exist today. They work, and they don't need Wi-Fi or electricity or even a reliable landlord. Just you, the earth, and enough determination to outlast the winter. So as you ease back toward the cellar door, leaving behind the cool embrace of survival's shadowy womb, you glance once more at those bundles of straw and barrels of silence. It's not glamorous, it's not pretty, but it's clever, stubborn, and deeply human. Your boots crunch lightly on frost-hardened grass as you make your way toward the village green. You're not looking for a market stall or a fancy kitchen. Tonight, S lesson takes place beside something much more ominous. A long, smoky shed that smells like campfires and cured meat. Welcome to the smokehouse, the medieval miracle box where food was preserved not by cold or earth, but by fire and patience. The door creaks open, and you're immediately swallowed by a dense curtain of smoke. It stings your eyes and coats your tongue, but under the ash and haze there's a deeper scent, rich, oily, and ancient. This is where hams, sausages, slabs of bacon, and even whole fish hang like forgotten relics, slowly transformed into survival gold by the low, persistent burn of hardwood embers. Smoke curing wasn't just a flavor enhancer, it was a full-blown science. The type of wood mattered: oak for strong preservation, applewood or cherry for something sweeter, hazel when the meat was gamey. You had to keep the temperature steady, avoid actual flames, and rotate the meat to prevent any over-smoking, which, yes, was a real concern. Charred outside, raw inside? That's not medieval gourmet. It's just a disappointment. You squint up at the rafters where strings of glistening sausages dangle in rows like medieval party streamers. Some have split from the heat, exposing soft, oily insides. Others look like they've been here for months, and they probably have. The longer it smoked, the longer it lasted. It was the slow cook setting of an era when stoves weren't even a concept. And it wasn't just meat. Cheese, salt, and even ale barrels were sometimes smoked to fend off mold or pests. In one monastery in 12th century England, monks experimented with smoke-drying apples, which reportedly tasted like chewy charcoal. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional snack or just a fruit gone horribly wrong. Here's a fun side note. The phrase, "where there's smoke, there's fire," had very literal consequences in a medieval village. Smokehouses were major fire risks, especially in timber-heavy towns. So many communities built them far away from homes, often near rivers or ponds where buckets could be filled fast. You didn't just protect your food. You protected your whole family from flaming doom. And believe it or not, smokehouses were also hiding places. During raids or tax collections, villagers sometimes slipped into the soot-filled dark to avoid detection. It was hot, it was miserable, and you'd smell like a walking fireplace for days. But it was better than being dragged off for unpaid grain dues. There's something weirdly comforting about the reliability of smoke. No batteries, no thermostats, no instruction manuals. Just a fire, some hooks, and a whole lot of standing around hoping you didn't ruin 3 months' worth of winter meat. It teaches you patience. Or maybe just how to ignore the feeling of always being slightly cold and hungry. You reach up and run your fingers along a dried rack of fish. It's leathery, stiff, and utterly unappetizing to your modern palate. But in the 1300s, this was luxury. Add a chunk of black bread and maybe some stale beer, you've got yourself a feast. Or at least a meal that won't kill you before spring. Remember that joke earlier about not surviving medieval life? Yeah, well, without the smokehouse, you definitely wouldn't. It was a cornerstone of year-round nutrition. If root cellars were quiet, cool guardians of the underground, then smokehouses were their fire-kissed, slightly dangerous cousins, keeping death at bay with each slow tendril of smoke curling into the rafters. As you close the door behind you and step back into the night, you exhale into the cold air and watch your breath mingle with the chimney's plume. Somewhere inside, tomorrow's breakfast is stiffening into shelf-stable security. It's not pretty, it's not quick, but it works. You shuffle past a stack of damp firewood and find yourself in the garden behind the manor house. Not quite a lush paradise, more like a scratchy mix of herbs, dirt, and optimism. Tonight, you're getting your hands dirty with a survival technique that didn't rely on meat, or smoke, or even fire, but on the subtle power of salt, vinegar, and the magic of pickling. Yes, pickling. Before it was trendy and came in mason jars with hipster labels, it was one of the few lines of defense between survival and scurvy. You kneel beside a wooden barrel half buried in the ground, the brine inside gently sloshing as you lift the lid. The smell is sharp enough to make your nose sting. a pungent combo of vinegar, dill, and what might have once been cabbage. You've entered the domain of the medieval pickle. Cabbage, turnips, onions, even eggs, basically anything not nailed down, was submerged in either saltwater brine or vinegar, then sealed in clay or wooden containers and buried or stored in cool, dark places. The goal wasn't taste, it was survival. A pickled onion might smell like regret, but it wouldn't rot in a February snowstorm. The science: salt pulls water out of the vegetable, creating an environment where good bacteria thrive and bad ones perish. It's like giving your veggies armor. Sour, slightly slimy armor, but armor nonetheless. And it wasn't just for peasants. Nobles had their own pickling preferences. In one 14th century household account, a cook recorded preserving rose petals in vinegar for medicinal tonics. Fancy and acidic. Meanwhile, villagers were packing wild garlic into jars like their lives depended on it. Because, well, they did. There's one surviving recipe from a German abbey that describes pickling trout with horseradish and juniper berries, which sounds delicious until you remember that it was then sealed with a layer of pig fat to keep the air out. Historians still argue whether this was actually edible or more of a punishment disguised as dinner. What's most striking, though, is how pickling wasn't just about preservation. It was about planning. It was forward-thinking in a world where most people didn't quite know if they'd be alive in 6 months. You plant the seeds in spring, harvest in summer, pickle in autumn, and hope like hell it's enough to get you through the wolf-howling heart of winter. And the techniques got creative. Some regions buried large stone jars in rivers, letting the cold water regulate the temperature naturally. Others left jars on high wooden racks where smoke from the fire could occasionally waft by, adding a hint of bonus preservation, or just making everything taste vaguely like bacon. Oh, and here's a quirky twist. In some parts of France and Wales, people believed burying a pickled onion under the hearth on the first day of winter would ensure your crops wouldn't rot the following year. It's either early agricultural superstition or the worst holiday tradition imaginable. You rise and brush your hands on your cloak, the sharp scent of vinegar still clinging to your sleeves. Your fingers are cold, your stomach is growling, and honestly, you're beginning to admire the people who made all this work without Tupperware or electricity. A jar of pickled eggs might not spark joy by modern culinary standards, but in the medieval world it meant the difference between fullness and famine, between a meal and a prayer. And maybe, just maybe, it's comforting to know that long before fridges and plastic wrap, people still found ways to prepare. They gathered, they packed, they pickled, they endured. In jars of sour root vegetables and salty trout fat, they left behind a quiet, briny legacy. You step back inside, ducking beneath a low wooden lintel, and find yourself surrounded by baskets. Baskets of dried apples, pears, plums, even thin rings of onions strung on twine like grim little garlands. Tonight, you're in the world of sun-drying and smoke-drying, nature's slow but determined way of saying, let's make this food last just a bit longer. Drying food seems so deceptively simple. Remove the moisture and bacteria, mold, and decay have less to feed on. But you're living in a time when the sun isn't always cooperative, and rain can turn a drying rack into a compost pile in under a day. So, the medieval kitchen adapted, using lofts, attics, smokehouses, and even the rafters above the hearth to hang food out of reach of pests, kids, and other opportunistic eaters. You glance upward and spot a cluster of dried sausages swinging like sleepy bats. The smoke has blackened them, and they smell like pepper, wood, and meat that's seen things. This was known as air curing, sometimes lasting weeks or even months. It was equal parts preservation, prayer, and patience. Apples were sliced thin and threaded on long strings, then hung above the stove or laid on woven racks in sun-warmed courtyards. In warmer regions, whole grapes were dried on slanted stone slabs until they turned into raisins. In colder climates, though, drying wasn't as easy. You might need to rely on the smoke chamber, a sealed-off room or attic where fish or meat was left to soak in the warm, ashen fog for days on end. You can almost feel the sting in your throat just standing here. One fringe technique involved drying meat by burying it in coarse salt and ash, then laying it on hot stones under canvas. Historians still argue whether this worked well or simply gave you gritty bacon and an excuse to never eat meat again. You tug gently at a dried fig, its skin wrinkled like an old farmer's hands. These little things could be stashed in cloth bags and carried into the winter months, nibbled sparingly when fresh food was just a rumor. And it wasn't all survival. Dried fruit often found its way into pottages or pies, sweetening up otherwise bitter meals. You'd never guess from looking at it, but that shriveled plum was the medieval answer to candy. Oh, and here has a little bonus fun. Monks in certain monastic orders believed that dried pears helped stave off sinful cravings. No, not hunger, actual lust. There are records of dried pear slices being handed out during confession like edible cold showers. Were they effective? Let ES just say historians still argue whether monks were genuinely more virtuous or just very good at writing things down. As you wander past bundles of herbs hung to dry, sage, rosemary, thyme, you realize the entire kitchen is its own preservation machine. The walls, the beams, the air, they all conspire to keep things edible just long enough. And if the smell of smoke clings to everything, so be it. That smokiness, that dryness, it's not flavor, not exactly. It's memory. It's planning. You move toward a corner shelf and spot something odd. Strips of meat tied with thread and left to dry in honey. Yes, honey. Its antibacterial properties made it a natural preservative, and some noble households used it to encase fruits or even raw meat. They'd carve the honey crust away months later to reveal a prize inside, like some sticky medieval Kinder Surprise. And again, none of this was perfect. Rats could chew through rafters. A humid week could ruin a month's work. A fire could take the whole kitchen down in minutes. But still, they dried and hung and smoked and waited, hoping to keep hunger at bay. So next time you see a shriveled tomato on your counter and reach to throw it out, remember, there was a time when shriveling was a strategy, not a sign of neglect. In the medieval kitchen, dried meant dependable. Wrinkled meant worthy. And that smoky, sweet smell in your nose right now? That's the scent of survival, wrapped in ash and thyme and slow patience. You don't just cook here. You endure. You brush your fingers along the rough edge of a clay jar, sealed with a waxy lid and wrapped in linen like a parcel hiding a secret. Inside is something slippery, pungent, and utterly necessary. Oil. Tonight, you're venturing into the slick and shimmering world of oil packing and fat sealing, one of the most underestimated medieval preservation techniques. If sun-drying was about taking moisture away, this method was about drowning danger beneath a greasy blanket. You tip the jar slightly, and a golden glint catches the candlelight. Beneath the surface of the olive oil rests a tangle of herbs and something that once resembled cheese, or perhaps a fish fillet. In Mediterranean climates where olives were plentiful and sunlight was almost aggressive, oil wasn't just a cooking medium. It was medieval Tupperware. Drop a wedge of hard cheese or a cut of salted meat into a jar, top it with oil, seal it with wax or linen, and you had a makeshift vacuum chamber. Well, not quite a vacuum, but close enough to slow bacteria down to a medieval crawl. The oil kept air out, and the salt already in the food did the rest. It was simple, slightly slimy, and surprisingly effective. But what about those chilly northern kitchens with no olive trees in sight? That's where animal fat took over. Duck fat, beef tallow, even butter, rendered down until liquid, then poured over cooked meat. You might have heard of this as confit. And yes, it was fancy French survival food long before it turned up in gourmet cookbooks. In rural manors or peasant huts, you'd find small crocks stuffed with meat scraps submerged in layers of fat like medieval time capsules. Pull it from a cold pantry months later, scrape off the top layer, and voila. Dinner, sort of. Sometimes sour, sometimes chewy, always slightly questionable. And if you're wondering whether it was safe, well, historians still argue whether those fat-sealed meats were truly preserved or just fermented enough to be politely ignored. You spot a smaller pot near the hearth. It holds bright green herbs suspended in oil like prehistoric bugs in amber. This isn't food, it's medicinal paste, because preservation wasn't just about meals. Medieval kitchens were also pharmacies, and oil was the base for many a poultice or soothing salve. A cook needed to know which oils were edible and which ones were best for that itchy rash you got after touching the wrong kind of moss. Here's your fringe fact for the night. In parts of Eastern Europe, there were whispered recipes for bog butter, giant chunks of butter buried in peat bogs to preserve them. Some of these were rediscovered centuries later, still intact, though very much not recommended for toast. You tip one jar too far and nearly spill it, catching the wax lid just in time. It's a reminder of the fragility of these methods. Oil can turn rancid. Fats attract rodents. And wax lids are no match for summer heat or curious children. This was no set-it-and-forget-it system. It required vigilance, noses tuned to the slightest shift in scent, and the courage to taste something that smelled, frankly, like it might try to bite back. There's something deeply intimate about this preservation style. You imagine a widow tucking away the last duck legs from winter, praying they'll last until Lent is over. Or a shepherd bottling up garlic cloves and oil to flavor his flatbread through the snowed-in months. These weren't just calories. They were hopes, preserved in gold and grease. Even noble households did this, not because they had to, but because the technique worked. And in a world where refrigeration was a fantasy and even cellars could fail, oil was a rare constant. It flowed, it covered, it sealed. A humble protector with a faint smell of olives and thyme. You wipe your fingers on a linen cloth and glance around. Every jar, every crock, every sealed pot in this room tells a story. Some are triumphs, others, not so much. But all of them are rooted in one unshakable truth. Food meant survival, and preservation meant peace of mind. And if that peace came drenched in fat, so be it. You'll take greasy hands over an empty stomach any night of the medieval week. You crouch down beside a barrel pushed snugly against a stone wall. Its wooden staves are dark with age and dampness, held tight by rusting iron hoops. You knock lightly, hollow but not empty. With a careful tug, you ease the lid open and whew. The unmistakable sting of fermentation wafts out, sharp enough to wake a slumbering bishop. And there it is, the sour, briny, eye-watering world of fermenting and pickling, the medieval way. Tonight, you're diving nose first into the bubbling crock of food preservation's most pungent player. Fermentation wasn't just a method. It was a philosophy. Let it rot a little, but not too much. Salt, air, time, and a healthy dose of faith in unseen microbes were the main tools here. That, and a barrel or two. Take sauerkraut, for example. You toss shredded cabbage into a barrel with salt, stomp it down, literally with your feet sometimes, and seal it tight. A few weeks later, you begot a tangy pile of preserved crunch that would survive winter and probably chase away scurvy. Yes, cabbage could be a lifesaver. Not glamorous, but heroic in its own vinegary way. And then there's the not-so-glamorous side. Fermented fish. Scandinavian peasants made something called surströmming, a sort of herring that's been salted just enough not to rot. Just enough. The smell is legendary, so strong that even modern airlines have banned it on board. Historians still argue whether medieval versions of these were made deliberately for flavor or just tolerated because food was scarce. Meanwhile, you lift a stone lid off a ceramic jar to find turnips, preserved in what looks like murky rainwater. You hesitate, but then remember this was a staple in some regions. Fermented root vegetables weren't just edible. They became easier to digest, sometimes even more nutritious. Your nose protests, but your curiosity wins. And don't forget pickling in vinegar, the tamer cousin of fermentation. In cities where trade brought in barrels of wine and ale, the byproduct, vinegar, became an everyday preservative. Onions, cucumbers, even fruit peels were submerged, jarred, and stored. No fridge, no problem. Just a shelf full of acidic attitude. Your quirky tidbit of the night? In some medieval monasteries, monks pickled everything from eggs to fish to walnuts, and even stored their ink in vinegar to keep it from going bad. So, yes, pickling was not just culinary but scholarly too. Back in the peasant hut, though, pickling was survival science. Imagine a mother crouching near the hearth, dropping carrots into a vinegar brine, muttering charms under her breath. Not because it was magical, but because the last jar exploded last winter. That's the thing. These methods weren't foolproof. Barrels leaked. Molds took over. Sometimes the food went from sour to terrifying. Still, they kept trying, because a properly pickled batch could last through spring when other stores had long since spoiled. In some households, those acidic jars even served as rudimentary medicine. Gargle some pickle juice for a sore throat, or dab it on a rash. And honestly, it worked more often than you'd think. You sit beside the open barrel, its sharp smell curling through the air, and you feel strangely safe. Something about fermented food says, "We planned ahead." It says, "We endured." Even if your tongue recoils and your eyes water, it still nourishes. That's survival wrapped in brine. By candlelight, the jars sparkle like treasure, even if they smell like old socks. You imagine the long winters, the lean years, the times when salt was too dear and vinegar too scarce, and yet someone still managed to bottle the bite of a summer radish or the snap of a green bean. These weren't delicacies. These were lifelines. And though modern preppers might stock freeze-dried meals and vacuum-sealed bags, they often forget the wisdom in a bubbling barrel of sauerkraut. It's not just about keeping food. It's about understanding that decay, when handled wisely, can be the very thing that saves you. You gently close the lid and seal the jar with wax. Tomorrow, the barrel will still be here, bubbling quietly, making magic that smells like monsters. You rub your palms together and duck into a cramped stone hut at the edge of the village. Just a single room, barely wide enough for the straw mattress and the rickety table. But it's not the size that matters. It's the ceiling, or rather, what's hanging from it. Above your head, stretching from one soot-darkened beam to the next, is a careful web of meat, herbs, roots, and bundles tied with twine. And in the center, catching your eye, a row of sausages, dry, speckled, and stiff as old rope. Welcome to the medieval art of air-drying and smoking, perhaps the most ancient form of food tech you never thought to learn. You squint up at the sausages, turning your head sideways like a curious cat. No labels, no expiry dates, just instinct and the scent of a dozen winters. Here you preserve with air, smoke, and time, an unhurried chemistry that even modern preppers overlook. Outside, a lean-to chimney puffs gently, its smoke curling beneath the rafters. The smell inside the hut isn't unpleasant. It's earthy, woody, faintly peppery. You smell alder, perhaps oak bark, maybe even juniper. Smoke wasn't just flavor, it was insurance. It killed off bacteria and discouraged bugs, and if it made your ham taste like a forest campfire, well, that was a bonus. One mainstream fact: medieval kitchens across Europe used smokehouses, some no bigger than closets, to preserve entire sides of meat. In the winter, these rooms might be constantly filled with hams, eels, even cheese, anything that would take the smoke. These weren't gourmet delicacies. They were fuel for long, bone-chilling months. But here's the fringe detail. In parts of Eastern Europe, peasants smoked not just food, but their clothes and bedding, believing it killed fleas and lice. Some even thought smoke blessed the food, keeping evil spirits away. Whether it worked or not? Well, that depends on your tolerance for smoky socks. You reach up and touch a dried sausage, wrinkled, dark, and surprisingly firm. It's been hanging for months. No mold, no smell. You wouldn't eat it raw, but boiled into a stew or fried with onions. It might just be the highlight of your month. Historians still argue whether all meats were cured with consistent techniques, or if most peasants just winged it and hoped for the best. There are records of entire village households falling ill after eating badly cured pork. But there are also stories, half folklore, half fact, of sausages hanging untouched for years, still safe to eat when boiled long enough. On a shelf, you notice flat sheets of something leathery. No, not parchment. These are meat sheets, thin slices of venison or mutton, salted, pounded flat, and air-dried. A medieval version of jerky, basically. Hunters and soldiers would carry it tucked into their cloaks, gnawing as they rode. And the hanging bundles of herbs. Not just for flavor, sage, rosemary, and thyme had mild antimicrobial properties. Tie them next to your hanging meat, and they might discourage bugs, or at least make the air smell better. Some households even burned the herbs in the fire pit, believing the rising smoke added magic to the preservation process. You sit down beneath the dangling strands, letting the fire's warmth rise up your back. Every now and then, a drop of fat softens and plops onto the floor from above. A gentle reminder that time never stops, even for dried meat. In modern prepping circles, air drying is rarely mentioned. It's too slow, too delicate, too dependent on the weather. But here, centuries ago, it was an art, a routine, part of life. Imagine the rhythm. Slaughter in autumn, cure with salt, smoke daily, check for mold, turn the meat, mutter a prayer, hang, forget, remember, and eat. Over and over, winter after winter. Your survival loop. You run your fingers along the twine holding the sausages. Each knot tells a story. Each shadow above the fire is a whisper of meals survived, storms endured, and families fed through silence and smoke. The air is thick but comforting. The hut is still. And you begin to understand. This wasn't just about hunger. It was about knowing. Knowing your food, knowing your fire, trusting that slow, invisible work was happening overhead, even as you slept. You step away from the smoky hut and into the cold air, boots crunching against frostbitten ground. Your breath curls in front of you like a spirit too lazy to haunt. In your hands? A chunk of dried fish, hard, gray, and stubbornly silent. If it could speak, it might beg for a bowl of broth, or at least a little warm wine. Tonight's focus is perhaps the least glamorous, but one of the most ingenious of medieval hacks: burying and underground storage. You squat beside a mossy hillock where flat stones mark something half forgotten, half revered. The root cellar, or, if you're Scandinavian, perhaps a jordkeller, a hole in the earth that quietly kept your family alive. Before refrigeration, the earth was your best ally. Under the right conditions, a few feet below the surface maintains a year-round temperature hovering between 40 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Not cold enough to freeze, not warm enough to rot. Just perfect for storing anything that needed to not kill you. You pry open the stone slab and descend into the soft dark. The air is dense and cool. The scent? Earth, turnips, maybe a hint of mildew, but not spoilage. Not yet. Wooden shelves sag beneath piles of cabbages, apples, onions, smoked meats, clay pots of butter, root vegetables, and in rare cases, cheese wrapped in linen and beeswax. No labels, just instinct and grandmotherly memory. You'd know that a potato gone bad smells like old regrets, and you'd learn to spot the whisper of rot with your eyes closed. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Most peasant homes in northern and central Europe had some form of underground storage. Root cellars, earthen pits, or cave niches carved into rock. Even city homes might have basement pantries, insulated with hay or wool. They were low-tech, high reliability, and often passed down through generations like family heirlooms. Now, the fringe tidbit. In parts of medieval Russia, peasants buried fermented milk in sealed bark containers. Yes, fermented, not spoiled, and dug it up months later to eat or sell. It was considered not just edible, but medicinal. If you ever wondered what courage tastes like, there you go. You brush your hand along the lumpy row of turnips. Some are pocked, a few squishy, but most firm and surprisingly aromatic. In the corner, baskets of apples rest gently atop straw. The straw insulates, but it also keeps fruit from touching, because contact spreads rot like gossip at a medieval tavern. Historians still argue whether peasant families shared these cellars communally or guarded them jealously. Some records suggest village elders rationed out storage space, others imply brutal hoarding during famine. One story from 14th century France describes a cellar booby-trapped with thorns and bells to keep out desperate neighbors. Medieval kindness had limits, especially when winter had teeth. You notice a clay jar, sealed with tallow and marked with wax symbols. Inside, probably butter or preserved eggs. Yes, eggs. People used methods like coating them in ash, brine, or even lime water. If you're wondering what a 7-month-old egg tastes like, let's just say it depends how hungry you are. The cellar's silence is spiritual. No buzzing flies, no snoring animals, just the slow breath of soil. This is where time sits cross-legged and waits, clutching your carrots and onions like offerings. Modern preppers often overlook underground storage. Why dig when you can buy a solar fridge? But here, back then, a hole in the ground meant dinner next March. It was simple, silent, immovable. A flickering candle shows dark stains where mold has crept along the stone wall. You'll need to scrub that, or risk losing everything. Spoilage doesn't knock. It just takes. You lean back, imagining yourself as a child down here, checking the onions every week like pets. Maybe naming the best cabbage, maybe learning, from your mother's scowl, which potato isn't dinner anymore. One turnip rolls slightly on its own, or maybe the candle wobbled. Either way, you chuckle and place it back. There's a rhythm to this. Bury, insulate, monitor, retrieve, over and over, like a low chant beneath the everyday noise of survival. The earth cradles your supplies in its arms. No fan, no buzzing, just a constant hum of temperature, pressure, and time. And even when war comes, or disease, or blight, if you've buried your treasures well, you just might make it through. Above you, the wind picks up, but down here, in this little cave of cabbage and hope, you are still and safe. For now. You haul yourself up from the earthy cellar and brush off the clinging dust of potato ghosts. Above ground, winter is growing teeth. Icier, meaner. You swear the wind bites a little harder every day like it's holding a grudge. Your next stop? A low shed with walls made of thick stone and roofed in thatch. Not glamorous, not cozy, but inside is one of the most misunderstood miracles of medieval survival. The smokehouse. Or, if you're particularly lucky or noble, a full smoking room, large enough to stand in, cough dramatically, and maybe faint a little from the fumes. Tonight, you're walking into the smoke. It stings your eyes immediately. That's on purpose. The fire's been smoldering for days, fed with damp wood, alder, beech, oak, if you're fancy. You duck beneath dangling ropes where slabs of bacon, fish, and even eels swing lazily like meaty wind chimes. Smoking meat isn't just about flavor, though sure, smoky ham slaps. It's preservation through dehydration and chemical warfare. The smoke contains phenols and formaldehyde. Bugs hate it. Bacteria, not welcome. Moisture, evicted. You? You're the slightly coffee caretaker of this edible museum. Mainstream fact time. Smoking meat goes back thousands of years, but in medieval Europe it became an everyday necessity. In England, France, and the Low Countries, peasants built small smoke sheds beside the main house. Wealthier folks had dedicated smoke chambers tucked inside towers or outbuildings. Fish was smoked immediately after catching, especially herring, which was an absolute staple from Norway to Italy. Now, the fringe tidbit. Monks in 12th century Germany allegedly smoked cheese. Not to preserve it, just to hide the smell from other monks during Lent. Penance came in many forms, and apparently, Gouda was one of them. You cough again and wave smoke away from your face. There's a rhythm to this too. The fire never flames, only smolders. Too hot, and you'll cook the meat. Too cool, and you just end up with fancy jerky that wants to kill you. There's even debate among historians. Did medieval peasants know how long was long enough to smoke meat? Or did they just go by smell, trial and error, and the occasional unfortunate guest? You grab a length of dried sausage, hard as a wooden spoon. It probably contains pork, garlic, and whatever was left. The casing is natural, of course, intestine. You stop chewing. Some things are best left in mystery. Beside the meats, you spot fish laid on racks. Smoked eel was especially prized. It stored well, traveled far, and required exactly 0 refrigeration. English monasteries even paid taxes in eel. If you ever feel your career lacks purpose, just remember that somewhere, someone was a professional eel tax accountant. You reach up to poke a hunk of dark brown pork. It swings gently as if contemplating your motives. You remember how, back in town, smoked goods were currency. Dried meat for grain. Smoked fish for candles. Trade wasn't always shiny coins, sometimes it was a solid bartering block of ham. The ceiling is black with soot. You wonder if it's been cleaned since King Edward III ruled. Probably not. Layers of old smoke clinging to every beam, every nail. This is medieval seasoning, a patina of persistence. You squat beside the fire pit, poke at the embers. Sometimes spices were added to the wood. Juniper, bay leaves, even rosemary. Not just for scent, but because certain woods produce better preservative smoke. Some French households swore by chestnut. Others claimed fruitwood kept insects away. Historians still argue whether spice smoking was for flavor or function. Either way, it gave you something to look forward to when chewing dried mutton for the 5th week in a row. You catch your reflection in the metal lid of the stew pot nearby. Eyes red, face smudged with soot, but smiling. Why? Because this, right here, is survival with flavor. You've outwitted the rot. You hang a new batch of rabbit legs, wrap your cloak tighter, and step outside. The smoke clings to you like an affectionate ghost. People will smell you coming from a mile away. And oddly enough, they'll probably be jealous. Back then, smelling like smoke meant you had food. And now you do too. Your cloak still carries the Smokehouse S signature perfume as you walk toward another curious monument of medieval ingenuity, the root cellar. Again? Yes, because the root cellar was no one-trick pony. This wasn't just a dusty bunker for carrots and parsnips. No, tonight you'll unlock its cold alchemy, a technique both terrifyingly simple and slightly brilliant. Layered storage. Picture it. Baskets stacked like Tetris blocks. Straw cushioning turnips. Clay urns sweating with pickled eggs. Apples tucked into sawdust like hibernating treasure. A whole ecosystem beneath your feet, hiding from the seasons. The root cellar wasn't just passive storage, it was strategy. You unlatch the thick wooden door, its hinges groaning like it hasn't had a visitor since the last plague. The cool air inside bites your nose, sharper than outside. You duck under the low arch and descend the short steps into what feels like a natural fridge. And, let's be honest, it smells weird. Not bad, exactly. Just earthy, acidic, a little like regret. But that's the smell of preservation. Historical fact alert. The root cellar was essential across Europe. Built partially underground with thick walls and sometimes thatched or turf roofs, these structures exploited the Earth's natural insulation. Temperatures inside hovered just above freezing in winter and stayed cool all summer. Some castles had vast cellars you could get lost in, like a very damp, vegetable-themed escape room. Now, here's your fringe tidbit. Peasants sometimes buried eggs in lime to preserve them for months. Yes, lime, as in calcium hydroxide. It sounds unappetizing, and it probably was. But it worked. Medieval survival wasn't about gourmet. It was about not dying of hunger in February. You shuffle between racks and crates, running your fingers along waxy cabbage heads and cloth-wrapped onions. Each layer of storage has its purpose. Apples separate from potatoes to avoid ethylene warfare, which makes things rot faster. Moisture-loving vegetables like carrots or leeks get buried in sand to hold humidity. Drier goods like garlic are hung from the ceiling like vampire repellents. It's part science, part superstition, and part, well, hope. You reach into a ceramic jar sealed with a waxy lid. The contents inside? Likely pickled mushrooms, floating in brine. There's a vinegar tang that hits your throat before you even open it. Pickling was one of the safest bets for preserving anything too moist to survive alone. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes you got botulism. Historians still argue whether peasants truly understood the chemical risks, or if they just learned through a Darwinian process of "don't eat what killed Uncle Fred." You pass a stack of barrels. One is labeled with a red mark, a family symbol or a superstitious glyph. You pop the lid and find salted cabbage, a proto-sauerkraut, sharp and clingy. Another holds apples, wrinkled, brown, but still edible. They're laid in straw and rotated every few weeks by hand. A tedious job, but if it meant not starving, worth the wrist-ache. Some cellars even featured small ice pits lined with snow and hay from the last freeze. If you were lucky, and let's be real, you weren't always, you could stretch that icy stash deep into spring, chilling milk or ale like a rustic mini-fridge. You dig a bit deeper and find the jackpot. A small crock of butter sealed in brine, like it's bathing in medieval spa water. Butter wouldn't last long without it. You remember reading that noble kitchens even buried sealed pots of butter in bogs. Yes, bog butter. Scientists dug some up after centuries and, well, let's just say nobody lined up for taste tests. A rat scurries along a ceiling beam. You tip your head in respect. He's trying to survive, too. Somewhere nearby, a drip echoes. You imagine the entire cellar breathing with you, like the earth itself is humming. It keeps things cold. It keeps you alive. And sometimes, just sometimes, it gives you an apple that doesn't bite back. The wind has picked up outside, rattling a loose shutter on the cottage you've been borrowing for this time-traveling stroll. But inside, the last place on your tour is far from drafty. It's the kitchen hearth. Not the romanticized kind with a cast-iron skillet and bubbling stew. No, this hearth is more like a bonfire someone shoved into a shoebox. But despite the smoke, soot, and firewood logistics, it is hiding one of the most brilliant food preservation hacks you've yet to explore: pot sealing with fat. Picture this: you've roasted a rabbit. Not the plump, store-bought kind. This one was twitching in a trap earlier. After skinning and cooking it, you shred the meat and pack it into a small ceramic pot. Then, and here's the magic, you pour a layer of hot lard or beef tallow over it. The fat cools, solidifies, and forms an airtight seal. Voila! Meat preserved for weeks, maybe even months, with no fridge, no salt, and no sorcery required. You're watching it happen now. Well, helping. A grandmotherly figure, missing 2 fingers and most of her patience, orders you to stir while she skims the lard. The scent is oddly comforting. Animal-rich, yes, but also warm and savory, with notes of sage and onion. She's humming something in a language that probably hasn't been spoken since your high school history teacher wore suspenders. She ladles the fat carefully, layering it atop the meat, then pats the top with a cloth and presses a wooden lid over it. This is confit, medieval style. Historians still argue whether it originated with peasants or passed down from noble kitchens, but one thing's clear: it worked. Meanwhile, your eyes wandered to a side table. There, small clay pots filled with cheese curds rest under another layer of fat. These, too, are sealed against air. The method is called potting, and though it sounds like a gardening hobby, it's dead serious. Air is the enemy of food. Block it out, and you block out rot. A fringe tidbit: some records suggest people also potted fish heads in fat for the same reason. Imagine cracking open a jar of oily carp skulls at a dinner party. Ah, the Middle Ages, where every snack was a dare. Back at the hearth, another technique unfolds: smoke infusion. While not quite smoking in the traditional hanging meat over fire sense, peasants would place cooked foods near the hearth, allowing the ambient smoke to permeate and act as a natural preservative. The room constantly smelled of wood smoke, burnt bread crusts, and, let's be honest, sweaty wool. But hey, no bacteria dared mess with that. You notice how many of these hacks are layered efforts. The meat is cooked, then sealed. The cheese is curdled, then buried in fat. Even dried fruits tucked into honey or vinegar get a dual preservation treatment. It's like everyone had trust issues with their food and created backup plans for their backup plans. Suddenly, the old woman motions you to the back shelf. She pulls out a dusty pot that looks older than most European monarchies. Inside, preserved duck legs buried beneath a dense crust of waxy white fat. She cuts a sliver off and warms it by the fire. The smell, salty, tender, slightly funky, tells you it's still good. Possibly amazing, possibly lethal, but you eat it anyway. It melts. It hums of rosemary and risk. While you chew, she mutters a phrase that you guess translates loosely to, "We eat what doesn't kill us." And you smile because survival, in this era, wasn't heroic. It was methodical, greasy, and a little gross. You clean up the hearth area, brushing crumbs into the fire and wiping the clay pot's rims. Everything gets reused. Wax is re-rendered. Fat is strained and stored again. Waste is a luxury no one can afford. And here's a bonus reality check. No medieval kitchen had a chore wheel. There's no meat sealing Wednesdays or butter rotation Fridays. It's a constant, rotating job. Someone's always grinding, sealing, stirring, watching the fire. And if they mess up, if the seal cracks or the pot leaks, they not just out a meal. They could be out an entire winter's protein supply. You glance around one last time, absorbing the chaos. Hanging herbs, smoke-stained beams, squeaky floorboards that probably double as mouse thoroughfares. You're not just in a kitchen. You're in a biochemical battleground where humans fight decay with fire, fat, vinegar, salt, and a stubborn refusal to give in to nature. Outside, the wind howls again. Inside, the last duck leg glistens beneath its armor of fat. And somehow, it'll still be there tomorrow. Your feet ache. Your brain feels marinated in medieval grease and cabbage. But there's one more forgotten survival technique to uncover before you collapse into the nearest straw mattress. Root cellaring. The name might sound cozy, even Pinterest-worthy, but don't be fooled. This was no rustic fantasy. It was damp, moldy, and slightly terrifying, but it kept entire communities alive when the ground froze, and hope did too. You duck through a low stone archway behind the cottage. A thin stairwell spirals downward, the air cooling with each step. You reach the root cellar. It smells like time itself, earth, onions, and a hint of regret. The floor is packed clay. The walls drip condensation, and yet, here in the gloom, food lives far longer than it has any right to. Barrels line the walls. One is packed with carrots buried in sand. Another contains beets nestled in straw. Cabbages hang like alien heads from the rafters, suspended by twine. Potatoes sprawl in crates, eyes sprouting defiantly. Everything is arranged with military precision, and yet it feels organic, like the earth itself is guarding the harvest. Root cellaring isn't just about shoving food underground and hoping for the best. It's a science, even if the term didn't exist yet. Airflow matters. Moisture matters. The placement of each item is deliberate. Apples, for example, are stored far from potatoes because they emit ethylene gas, which causes the spuds to sprout early. Who knew apples were secretly chaotic? You run a hand along the rough wood of a shelf. Every item has been cooled naturally by the stable underground temperature, usually hovering around 4 to 10 degrees C. In winter, it's just warm enough to prevent freezing. In summer, just cool enough to slow decay. Modern preppers build entire walk-in coolers to replicate this. But medieval peasants, they just dug holes and worked with what nature gave them. Historians still argue whether root cellars originated in Northern Europe or evolved independently in multiple cultures, but they all agree. They worked. In fact, some medieval monasteries maintained 3 separate underground chambers, each with specific airflow and humidity for maximum preservation. And here's your fringe tidbit of the evening. In parts of Eastern Europe, families used to bury live cabbages in pits for the winter, pulling them out one at a time like terrifying leafy time capsules. The flavor? Strong. The smell? Legendarily bad. But boiled with grains or mashed into stews, they kept people full. You pick up a parsnip. It's firm, cold to the touch, and slightly dirty. You imagine biting into it raw, but decide against it. This is survival food, not a snack. It's meant to outlast everything. Frost, rats, even famine. And it often did. The old woman from the kitchen earlier joins you. She lights a small tallow candle and checks each barrel with the care of someone inspecting treasure. She taps the sides, lifts cloth covers, frowns at a sprouting onion. This is not just food storage, it's a living calendar. A countdown to spring, 1 potato at a time. And here's the kicker. They had to remember it all mentally. No spreadsheets, no barcodes, no use-by dates. They just knew which turnip went in first, which apples to eat now, and which were destined for Christmas. Every mistake was a gamble, and every victory was eaten. As she extinguishes the candle, she gives you a stern look, equal parts warning and pride. You climb back up the stairs, brushing dirt from your sleeves, and re-enter the warmth of the main room. You've seen 7 survival methods tonight: fermentation, salting, drying, pickling, smoking, sealing in fat, and now burying in earth. Each one is a chapter in a manual that modern preppers barely scratch the surface of. Each one was born not of curiosity, but of desperation and hard-won wisdom. And each one, in its strange, smelly, hands-on way, kept people like you alive for centuries. Now the fire burns low, casting flickers across the hearth. The old woman is asleep in a chair, snoring softly with a cat curled on her lap. Outside, the wind dies down. Inside, everything is preserved: food, silence, memory. You settle into the straw mattress by the door, still warm from earlier cooking. Your eyes close, but your mind drifts through barrels of apples, crocks of lard, smoky rafters, and cabbage-filled pits. Let's slow it all down now, just for a moment. The fire has dulled to a sleepy ember now, crackling once every so often, as though even the wood itself is winding down for the night. The cottage is wrapped in a blanket of silence, thick and comforting, with only the occasional creak of timber or rustle of wind-stirred leaves outside. You shift beneath a woolen blanket, scratchy but warm, and listen to the sounds of the past settle around you. Somewhere in the root cellar, a drip echoes quietly into the soil. The last breath of smoke curls toward the rafters. Everything stored, sealed, buried, or brined is resting, waiting for need to stir it awake again. You realize that survival wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't swords or battles or royal decrees. It was quiet ingenuity, practiced day after day in shadowy kitchens and underground cellars. It was ordinary people doing unremarkable things, remarkably well. Let the slow rhythm of that thought lull you now. Preserved peas in stone crocks, cured meat under fat, turnips in straw. It's all still there, waiting enduring. You're safe for tonight. The fire is warm, the food will keep, the wind can do whatever it likes. Now take a deep breath, exhale slowly, and let your body follow the pace of history. Steady, unhurried, resting. Sleep comes gently, like snow over a root cellar, sealing everything in peace. Sweet dreams.